we're going to talk about Indo-China. That is the region, of course, not Indo-China, guys. It's not India and China. But yes, when I talk about India and China, so the question might come across your mind like, what do you understand? What do you want to say when you talk about Indo-China and we want to talk about their relations? So we never use the word Indo-China when we talk about the diplomatic relations between India and China. So in that particular scenario and case, the media prefers to use something that's Indo-Sino relations. So we've kept this term exclusively for the three countries that we're going to talk. The first one being Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, that lies very near to Strait of Malacca and Singapore. So just wanted to bring to your kind notice that in case of Indo and China relationship, we use the word Indo-Sino, but whereas because of these three countries, they have a great influence of Chinese culture, the Confucianism, Buddhist practices, and then it was sort of occupied by Japan, then US intervened into the war. So they have quite a long history of struggle, and also the war that took place there was also declared as the first war, the television war. So we're going to look into some of the most important questions from this chapter. So let's get started. The very first question is, examine the new challenges which the new Republic of Vietnam faced after 1954. So yet Vietnam gained its independence well in time. However, it took it almost 3 decades to become a republican state. So that means it had a very long history from getting converted into independent state and then getting set up, setting its position up to a republican concept. So there was a ruler, what happened is the whole story, there were some challenges that the new Republic of Vietnam had to face. I'm going to address all those challenges right here, point by point to point. I'm going to move on. So the very first challenge that we're going to talk about and address it well is that French somehow tried to regain their control by installing the puppet ruler back to its position so that people feel connected, that of course French people are not here to colonize us. They want to make us stay connected with our ruler. But actually it was a very diplomatic move by the French people, because they wanted to install that puppet ruler, however made sure that they control that region with this puppet ruler installed there. So yes, Vietnam had to fight with, the people were now very aware, and they had to fight with the French people for about 8 years to finally defeat France in 1954. And second important fact that was the move that was made was the negotiations were put on table at Vietnam that sort of partitioned Vietnam into negotiation took place in Geneva that sort of partitioned, so I'm going to underline peace negotiation at Geneva, that partitioned Vietnam into North and South Vietnam. So of course the North and the South Vietnam was ruled by this puppet ruler Bao Dai in South, and finally he was turning really autocratic. So finally he was overthrown by Ngo Dinh Diem. So his policies, led to a war between North and South Vietnam. So that is how they wanted to, attain a final unification. So yes, after the French left over, Vietnam was divided into 2 sections, the North and the South Vietnam. And then what we realized after this division is that, it's not just that the division took place. Now US had even to jump into war. So US was so apprehensive about the fact that communist tendencies are growing, they're taking shape, and I don't want that to happen. So US started sending its troops, its arm, and brutally massacring all the people. There was a lot of casualties that were associated, and long wars were there with US troops. So some of the people, they sort of projected that US is doing justice, whatever the people are doing, it's for the betterment of the people, for the government out there. So that means there was a huge loss of men and property, destruction of the environment because of all those deadly weapons that they used in the war. So it was all the poisonous weapons that they used that ultimately led to a lot of casualty. So these are all the important parameters that when you have to address that, yes, these were the new challenges that were faced by the new Republic of Vietnam after 1954. So the very first one, that French tried to regain control over the area by, putting in place some puppet ruler through which they could automatically have their control over the region. Then they sort of, defeated the paper, resisted the move. They defeated France, and then Vietnam was in short divided into two sections. The southern part was led by No Dinh Diem, and finally he was a person who had actually overthrown the Bao Dai's regime. And finally, what happened after all this is that US also couldn't stop itself because it feared regarding the spread of the communist tendency, so it had to jump into the war. So people projected both positive and negative aspects of the war, and finally there was a lot of casualty. You have to mention it. There was a lot of casualty and destruction to the environment. So you can underline the entry of US here, and then you can talk about loss of men and property, that is destruction of environment. US entered the war. So you can either write these phrases and then explain the pointers, or probably you can explain it this way and underline the important phrases the way I have done in this question. Now, jumping on to the next important question that we have here is, why did the French want to colonize Vietnam? You have to explain, they've clearly mentioned it, you have to explain 4 reasons. So see, French people, or may it be any European power, they thought of, wanted to extend their control onto the other countries, not only to get raw material, but yes, to ensure that they have a regular supply, that they can supply to the colonies also, the finished goods can be supplied. So yes, number 1, of course, they were looking for some sort of raw material. Then again, they were looking for a market that would help them sell off their surplus goods. The third important point is they wanted to ensure that it is a white man's burden to, civilize the uncivilized section. For example, right here, I have clearly mentioned that following were the main reasons for colonizing Vietnam by the French people. For example, they believed that colonies are essential, like we just talked about, to supply raw material and natural resources to their motherland. Second, moreover, they also believed that it was the mission of the advanced nations to bring in or to civilize the backward people. Here the backward people means the people living in Vietnam. And they also wanted, like I told you, they wanted a market for their finished goods. So to ensure higher level of profit for their business, yes, they were looking for markets, but for this, they had to ensure that the people of Vietnam have a very good standard of living. But most of the people in Vietnam were not educated, not enjoying a good standard of living. So they wanted to create a, it's like, bringing the people, getting them into your own culture, your own traditions. So yes, they wanted the people in Vietnam to respect French people, to respect their history, to respect their sentiments, their culture, their concept, even if that meant that, the Vietnamese are not, their culture is crushed, they are not given due respect. So everything is okay to them unless and until the French people get that touch of superiority. So I've addressed 4 reasons. They wanted a class solidarity. Then we talked about the supply of raw material, market for finished goods, and mission of civilization. Guys, this question is can be expected this year. It is a very, very, very important question. So please take care when you are answering a question like this. Okay, jumping on to the next question. Describe the influence of China on Vietnam's culture and life. Like I guys told you that Vietnam was living under the shadow or culture of China for quite some time. So yes, the people had their links with China, you know, through that trade, marine silk route that passed through Vietnam, crossed China, and you know, they sort of had shared religion, like I told you, Buddhism and Confucianism. So Vietnam was actually a neighbor of China, living under the shadow of China, and also acting as a trade link when it comes to marine silk route. So the ideas of the thinker Confucian, who wanted the people and their rulers to have a relationship as ideal and as real as parents and their children have. So they wanted a very strong bond between the rulers and their people who are being ruled by the rulers. They wanted a very sacred bond. So all these thinkers, they had a very great influence. Their philosophy had touched the people living in Vietnam. Their social aspect was touched, their cultural aspect was touched. So yes, the very first point is in terms of religion and you know, ideology, they had a very, very big influence. Second is with respect to trade. So here you are going to talk about religion, and you're going to mark this point right under the heading of religion. Here you're going to talk about trade links, and then you're going to make sure that you talk about that yes, the Trans-Indo-China rail was also developed by the imperialist power, as they wanted to connect North and South Vietnam, not because they were looking at the development of the country, but because they wanted to serve their own purpose. They wanted to supply the finished goods. They wanted the rulers to have the Chinese system of government and culture in Vietnam. So they wanted to make sure that China is actually acting as a great influencer. May it be in any field, may it be in trade, may it be in religion, may it be in culture. So yes, a lot of people living in Vietnam, even after the French people colonized that nation, they had great links with the Chinese culture. So jumping on to the next question, division of Vietnam set in motion series of events that turned the country into a battlefield. So you have to support. So when I talk about division of Vietnam, that of course means that Vietnam was divided, like we just discussed in the previous question, into South and North Vietnam. And of course, the North Vietnam, now I look at the pattern of the question, how it is being attempted. So first I told what is the story behind the division. So yes, I'm going to give a very good introduction in which I'm going to give a brief overview of the story. So first you are going to give a brief overview regarding the story, that yes, after the Geneva, that you're going to underline, conference or convention in 1954, after the French power was defeated, the Vietnam Peninsula was divided into two sections, the North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Now I'm going to tell you the sequence of events that turned the country into battlefield. So what happened is, the North Vietnam, please talk about North Vietnam first, and then you're going to talk about the South Vietnam. For example, North Vietnam was under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, whereas the South Vietnam was under the ruler of Bao Dai, who was later overthrown by No Dinh Diem, and this is the person who actually had overthrown the person Bao Dai. So what happened because of this, because of the division, a sequence of events, they were set in motion, forcing Vietnam to get into a battlefield, change into a battlefield. So what happened, this person, No Dinh Diem, he sort of got really autocratic in his conduct, and you know, whosoever used to turn against him, he would put him right behind the bars. So it was like he, you know, wanted everybody, he wanted to ensure that there is censorship, and you know, turned sort of dictatorial and opposed this. Under this, he was, you know, opposed by a lot of people. So Diem's dictatorial regime was opposed by broad section under the banner of NLF. So Bao Dai was defeated by this person, No Dinh Diem, and he was, because he was turning really autocratic, so they thought, okay, we're going to overthrow him. And that was done under the banner of National Liberation Front. So they sort of got the support of the person who was ruling North Vietnam, that is Ho Chi Minh. So he you know, tried to connect with the NLF and, you know, tried to bring North and South Vietnam together to unify the country, because now, you know, the communist tendencies were coming into motion, into force. So yes, automatically the US government has to kickstart its motion and, you know, jump into the territory so that the communist forces do not grab the country, do not hold the country for that matter. So yes, UN intervened into the war, and this led to even a civil strife that turned Vietnam into a virtual battlefield. So did you get the feel of the answer? Now you provide the answer, you know, you mug up the points and then you give the content right there and then. No, but there's a particular pattern and a set of events that I've probably followed in this answer. The very first is I've given a brief overview that yes, there was a Geneva conference that led to split of Vietnam. Then North Vietnam was under the control of Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam was first ruled by Bao Dai, and he was overthrown by No Dinh Diem. Finally, because he got really dictatorial in his power, autocratic sort. So yes, the section that turned against him was none other than NLF, that's National Liberation Front. So NLF got in touch with Ho Chi Minh to, you know, unite Vietnam. Because US feared the spread of communist power, so of course US had to intervene and get into pictures to get things rolling so that the communist tendencies do not spread, and rather it protects the capitalist position. It's right there, right intact. So that is why US intervened. That led to a civil war and a lot of casualty. Let's start with the next question. Next question is, which were the two major problems before the French in the colonial education in Vietnam? Second part of the question is, how did they try? So what is, first they're asking about the basic problem. So what was the major problem? Then they're asking how was it resolved or solved? And third part, they're asking you to explain each case. So let's start. What was the basic problem? Basic two problems that the French people were facing was the medium of education that they're going to follow, and if they are, you know, the French people might lose their job, the colons might lose their job, because if Vietnamese get educated, they're going to stand up for their rights, they're going to take all the important positions in the government. So yes, the basic major problems that French people were actually looking for, you know, a very educated labor force. They sort of wanted to have good people who could work for them. They wanted education, you know, people from the education field who could really do well. But once educated, they also feared that Vietnamese might start questioning their power. So it was like, another problem in the education field was that they never wanted cross-questioning coming their way, and second was that, you know, they might sort of in the field of education, the elite Vietnamese, because they had a great influence of that Chinese culture. So the French people had not only to consolidate their power on Vietnamese, but they also had to fight against the Chinese culture when it comes to education, when it comes to bringing the people follow the pattern and the culture that they are promoting. So in order to consolidate or solve their problems, the French people opened. So how did they? I've addressed the two problems. The very first problem is this. The second problem is that they had to counter the French influence anyway. So this was done by the, thought of these two problems were thought by the French people. Now, a solution to solve these problems was that yes, they opened special schools that are known as Tonkin free schools. Please don't forget to underline this. That was spreading a very different style of education that was not there in Vietnam. That's Western style of education. So it was, it sort of dismantled all the traditional values that Vietnamese used to follow, their system, and tried to establish that French control, project French people superior, respect them. But however, they also ensure that French is a medium of instruction in higher languages. So if you use that French language, anyway, you're going to respect their culture. You're not going to be left with any other option, and you're going to feel the culture, the tradition, and you automatically will start respecting their culture. So that's what you have to cover in this answer. Now, jumping on to the next question, which is explain the steps taken by French in the field of education in Vietnam. The very first set of questions. The second is, what was their motive behind this? Now, as I just explained you, the French people were facing a lot of issue when it comes to education, when it comes to civilizing the people. So what were the steps that they took in battle in this is, like we've just discussed, yes, in order to resolve the issue, they set up Tonkin free schools in 1907 to provide, Western style of education that had three basic areas of concern: science, hygiene, and French. Plus, in order to make sure that the people in Vietnam are respecting their culture, following their practices and stuff like that, they ensured that the school textbooks are actually glorifying the French practice of imperializing or maybe consolidating power in these countries and, civilizing them, because they believe that the Vietnamese can only act as skilled copies. Like they can just copy paste the stuff. They can't act creative. They are not creative. So they could not rule themselves. So the schools encourage that, of course, in order to ensure that you guys are civilized enough, you guys can rule yourself, can govern yourself, it's very, very important that you adopt the Western style and Western ideas, for which we are giving you education at Tonkin free schools. So explain, I've rightly explained the steps taken by the French people in the field of education in Vietnam, that they opened Tonkin free school where they taught this. And second, their motive was that they wanted to glorify, they wanted to justify their rule, their existence, their presence in the country, which could no way be done other than glorifying all that through the textbooks, ensuring that they are made aware that they are down and we guys are way more superior to them. Okay, so this is how I have segregated the answer, because the question was asked in two sections and I have answered it in two sections. Now let's jump on to the next question. The motive behind the motive behind the introduction of French education was. So the very motive behind this education was that they were looking that they wanted to glorify, we just discussed, they wanted to glorify and justify their rule. They wanted to introduce Vietnamese to their own culture. They wanted a skilled workforce and they wanted to dismantle their education system. So these are the four motives that we just discussed and you're going to mention them clearly. So see, I have clearly segregated the answer into two parts. The very first as the steps taken by the French people. So these were the steps taken by, you can erase this. So these were the steps taken by the French people, and then we have talked about the justification or the motive behind the introduction of French education. Okay, so let's jump on to the very next question. Describe the views of Paul Bernard on the question of development of colonies. Mention any three borders to which they were a hurdle in improving the economy of the Vietnam. Now, talking about this person, it's very important to quote what was the view of Paul Bernard on the importance of development of colonies. So he basically argued that yes, it's the countries have been colonized or acquired to make profit, and this can only be done if the people living there have a good standard of living, like they have a good economic growth, a sustainable growth by which they're gonna compensate or take our goods and services that are being supplied to them. Now his views, I'm going to segregate his views first and then divide it into three points that were in sort of hurdle that improved the economy of Vietnam. For example, the first point is that he argued that the purpose was to make profit. Like we just discussed, that the economy was to be developed, the standard of living is to be raised, but not because the people living there, it's for the betterment of the people, but because of this, these people, the French people, can supply their finished goods and they can make profit out of it. So his first intention was so that their home country can make a lot of profit. So first opinion is about profit. Second, he sort of believed that there were a lot of barriers to economic growth. So, you know, the economy of Vietnam cannot grow because a lot of people who were living there, you know, they were indebted, they were agricultural workers, you know, peasants were also there. So in order to improve the agricultural productivity and reduce the poverty, it was necessary that reforms are carried out on the line that the Japanese government also introduced in 1890s. So yes, they wanted to, you know, remove all the barriers. They wanted the country to grow in economic terms so that they can make best out of the available set of resources that they have. And yes, they also wanted to ensure that they have, sufficient employment, because, you know, the French people, they sort of wanted to follow the Japanese example of industrializing Vietnam and create more number of jobs. But for jobs, they did want educated people to serve them, and because they believe that Vietnamese can only be skilled copyists, so they wanted to ensure that yes, if they are working for them, at least they have certain level of education and also a very good respect towards their culture and tradition. So these were the opinions that Paul Bernard had put forward when it comes to economy of Vietnam. Jumping on to the next important question, what were the results of the colonization of Vietnam by the French people? So this speaks highly of what was the result. See, of course, the ultimate result, if any country colonizes any particular country. Now, if this has been asked in a 3-mark question, please ensure that you provide at least 80 words and ensure that every word or every point is given in bullets or separately by numbering them. You have to ensure that you provide the content rather than writing it in a paragraph. So yes, the very first clause was the natural resources that were used by the French people to make profit for their mother country, and also in order to sort of have their control and consolidate power, they were dismantling all the local cultures, all the practices, and promoting Christianity. Then modern education was also introduced and Vietnamese style of education was dismantled. This was done to ensure that the French culture and the French colonizing mission is actually glorified, and people in Vietnam start to believe that it's very important for them to modernize, yet they cannot modernize all by themselves, but they need an authority to modernize them. And last and the very important point of result of colonization of Vietnam was that they prevented the people of Vietnam to qualify for white-collar job. White-collar means very good job that pays you really well. So they resisted, they followed this practice of deliberately failing you in the last year because they never wanted Vietnamese to compete with the colons. Now, who was the colons? Colons were the French people living in Vietnam and doing really well. So they wanted to educate them because they wanted to have an educated workforce, but at the same time, they never wanted them to compete with the French people in white-collar jobs. Okay guys, so on that note, we are done with these points. So let me underline the important points that we discussed. Natural resources, exploitation, then they introduced Christianity, then modern education system was introduced, and then they prevented qualifying in white-collar jobs. So I have underlined, this is how, if you're writing a point like this, either you can underline it, or the other way around to go for this question is talk about natural resources, exploitation of natural resources, give the answer. Spread of Christianity, put the point across. Introduction of modern education, state the answer, and prevent deliberate practice of failing, and then you can put your answer across. This is the right way that you have to answer your question. Please do not follow the practice or promote the practice of answering your questions in the form of paragraph. That is not going to fetch you marks. Next important question is explain any 3 steps. This is going to be there for 3 marks. 3 steps taken by the French to achieve their aim. So yes, when I talk, French people try to consolidate I'm going to give the introduction that yes, their main intention was to exploit the natural resources of Vietnam. Now, what were the steps taken by them? The very first step that we're going to talk, and I'm going to tell you the bullet point in this. First, they wanted to ensure that they have a regular supply of natural resources. So, you are going to talk about, first point is natural resources. And then you're going to underline it and then write the point that, to ensure a regular supply of natural resources and other necessity goods, the French people, started all the infrastructural development like roadways, railways. Second important point, building of canals. So you're going to talk about canals, that yes, they had an extensive network of canals, not because they wanted the development of Mekong Delta, but yes, to ensure that this area provides maximum output of rice cultivation, and they did succeed in achieving this goal. Then we're going to talk about the third point, to facilitate various products. They sort of brought about changes in transportation. That means they built a lot of rail links. They, tried to control power by, starting the transportation network that would bring North and South Vietnam together to move. But all this was done with the main intention to support their presence, to make sure that they are, there in the country and they rule and govern the country for long. So these are going to be the 3 important steps: natural resources, canals, and then transportation. So you've covered all the important points if you talk about these 3 bullet points and explain them briefly in this answer. This is going to get you marks for 3 steps taken by the French people to achieve their aims. And not even, you can stop not even here. If this question is asked for 5-mark question, you can even add another point talking about education, that they did introduce Tonkin free schools to provide a good education to the people, a Western touch. And also the last point can be, they wanted to consolidate their power. So they, started promoting Christianity, which actually dismantled all the local traditions, customs, and this is how they tried to consolidate their power with each step. Natural resources, canals, religion, transportation, education. So yet you have covered all the important points. May it be 3-mark question, may it be a 5-mark question. You can also talk about religion. So I have given you important points on that. Okay, so next question is, why did French policymakers want to educate the people of Vietnam? Because they believed that they were skilled copyists and they can't work for themselves or act creative. Second part of the question is, what were the differences of opinion between the two groups regarding the introduction of French education in Vietnam? So first, I've answered the first section, that yes, the French policymakers wanted to educate the people because they considered that, of course, education is going to help them get civilized. They wanted to convince that Europe is the most developed nation. They have the white man's burden of civilizing mission that they have to promote, that it's their duty to give to promote or bring in modern ideas into the colonies. And the main reason was, out of all the reasons that we've talked about here, the main reason or the mother reason was that they wanted to they needed an educated workforce for themselves, so that they could serve a purpose, or they could probably work for them. Now, what was their opinion? So there were two broad opinions. The second question, the second part of this question, just leave a line and or start with the next paragraph. The two broad opinions were on the question of introduction of French language. Now, some emphasize that what is going to be the medium of instruction. Are we going to follow, French language as a medium of instruction, or are we going to follow, Vietnamese as a medium of education? So when I talk about French, and some felt that, of course, Vietnamese should be introduced so that the culture of France does not impact the life of the people. By this, they considered, if French culture is going to come, they're going to overtake all the natural tradition that they have. Educated people in Vietnam would then probably start respecting the French sentiments, and the French authority would be declared to be far more superior and good. Whereas the second reason was that what is going to be the medium of instruction? They suggested that it's not going to be the French language. We are supposed to follow the Vietnamese, and Vietnamese can be taught in the lower sections, whereas you can use the French language in higher classes. So, but by this, they would probably respect their own culture. They would stay in touch with their own mother tongue, and then go and get qualified for good jobs once they opt for the French language or the French set of questions that they answer in the paper. So yes, they wanted that, okay, French culture is acquired. This would not take away all the basic mother traditions, and everybody would not feel that yes, French people are far more superior as compared to the Vietnamese. So these were the two contradictory opinions that we have. First, we've given the answer what policymakers thought. Then we've talked about the two broad objective, whether it's going to be Vietnamese as a medium of instruction, or is it going to be the French language, which is automatically going to declare a sense of superiority of French culture, and there's going to be a French work culture also. So that is all. So on that note, I would end this lecture. Thank you so much for attending. The PDF link for this series and this video is available on our app, and the app link is provided right there in the description box. So please make sure you download the app to gain access to the PDF, and also to resolve your questions. We'll be there. You can ask your doubts, and also keep watching the videos that's going to come up next for the SprintX classes. So until we meet next for the next chapter with the important set of questions, I would ask you to take care, stay healthy, stay hydrated, and thank you so much for being so patient. Thank you, guys.